Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy. When it comes to serial killers, we tend to focus on their crimes rather than their mental health. But what if there's more to these men than just their heinous acts? What if there's a way to understand their minds that might help us understand our own? Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to delve into the twisted mind of one of the most infamous serial killers in history. So grab a cup of tea or maybe scotch ready for this. In 1964, a 21-year-old man named Richard Ramirez went on a crime spree that left 13 people dead. He was eventually caught and sentenced to death, where he spent his remaining days writing letters to friends and family, drawing pictures of skulls and crossbones, playing Monopoly and watching porn. But Ramirez wasn't your typical criminal. In fact, he had a lot of similarities with the rest of us, which is why it's important to study his case. When you look at Ramirez's life, there are some things that stand out immediately. He grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in Los Angeles with two parents who were immigrants from Mexico. From an early age, Ramirez was drawn to violence, which he expressed by torturing small animals and killing roaches. He also had a violent temper and would lash out at anyone who upset him. By the time he was 13 years old, Ramirez had already been arrested twice, once for burglary and once for sexual assault. He continued to get into trouble throughout high school and eventually dropped out without graduating. Despite his troubled past, Ramirez was able to enlist in the U.S. Army, where he served until 1974. It was during his time in the military that he committed his first murder. Ramirez was stationed in Germany when he met a young woman named Dorothy Louise. The two began dating, and soon after Ramirez moved in with her and her two roommates. On August 1st, 1974, Ramirez woke up early in the morning feeling angry and agitated. He had been having problems with his superiors in the army and was feeling desperate. Without warning, Ramirez pulled out a knife and stabbed each of his roommates to death. He then fled the scene and went on the run. Ramirez was eventually caught and charged with murder. However, thanks to some shoddy police work, he was able to escape custody and go on a crime spree that would make him one of the most wanted men in America. Ramirez's rampage began in San Francisco, where he broke into a home and killed 4 people. He then headed south to Los Angeles, where he continued his killing spree. Ramirez's victims were typically young men who he lured into his car with promises of money or drugs. Once inside, he would beat, torture, and rape them before eventually killing them. He would then dispose of their bodies in secluded areas around the city. It wasn't long before the police caught up with Ramirez. He was arrested on October 1984 and charged with 13 counts of murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and Ramirez was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he spent the rest of his life. So what makes Ramirez's case so interesting is not his crimes, but rather his personality. You see, when he was arrested, psychologists were brought in to evaluate his mental state. They found that Ramirez was suffering from sociopathic personality disorder, which is characterized by a lack of remorse or shame, as well as antisocial behavior. But they also found something else. They found that Ramirez had above-average intelligence and a normal childhood, which was shocking given his heinous crimes. This led them to conclude that Ramirez wasn't simply a product of his environment, but rather someone who was born with certain predispositions that made him violent. This is where things get really interesting, because it turns out that Ramirez was the only serial killer with these same traits. In fact, many of the most notorious serial killers in history share these same characteristics, leading psychologists to believe that there may be a genetic component to their behavior. There are several theories as to why this might be the case. One theory is that there may be a link between low levels of serotonin in the brain and aggressive behavior. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter which helps regulate mood, sleep, and appetite. Low levels of serotonin have been linked to increased levels of aggression, impulsivity, and depression. Some studies have found that criminals tend to have lower levels of serotonin than non-criminals. This could explain why so many serial killers are impulsive and lack remorse. Another theory is that there may be a link between brain damage and violent behavior. Studies have shown that criminals are more likely to have brain damage than non-criminals. This damage can occur before birth, during birth, or after birth. It could be caused by anything from lead poisoning to abuse. Brain damage has been linked to increased levels of aggression, impulsivity, and emotional instability. This could explain why some serial killers are so emotionally detached. It's also worth noting that there may be a link between childhood trauma and violent behavior. Studies have found that criminals are more likely to have experienced some form of childhood trauma, such as physical or sexual abuse. This trauma can cause changes in brain structure and function that make it more likely that someone will engage in criminal behavior. This could explain why so many serial killers come from dysfunctional families. The final theory is that there may be a link between certain hormones and violent behavior. Testosterone is a hormone that plays a role in aggression, dominance, and territoriality. High levels of testosterone have been linked to increased levels of aggression and impulsivity. Studies have found that criminals tend to have higher levels of testosterone than non. This could explain why serial killers are often impulsive and aggressive. Another hormone that has been linked to violent behavior is cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone that is released in response to perceived threats. High levels of cortisol have been linked to increased levels of aggression and anxiety. Studies have found that criminals tend to have higher levels of cortisol than non-criminals. This could explain why some serial killers are so anxious and paranoid. These are just a few of the theories as to why there may be a genetic component to violent behavior. It's important to note that none of these theories have been proven, but they are thought to be promising areas for future research. As we continue to learn more about the brain and behavior, it's possible that we will find other factors that contribute to violent behavior. It's also possible that there is no single factor that causes someone to become a serial killer. Rather, it is a combination of factors that interact to create the perfect storm. Whatever the cause, it is clear that serial killers are not simply monsters. They are human beings who, for whatever reason, have been driven to extreme acts of violence. Understanding what drives them is not only fascinating, but it could also help us understand ourselves better. After all, we all have the capacity for violence, and understanding what pushes people over the edge could help us prevent future tragedies. Richard Ramirez died in prison on June 9th. At the age of 53, he was one of the most notorious serial killers in history, and his crimes shocked the nation. But Ramirez's story is more than just a horror story. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked evil. Ramirez's crimes were so heinous that it is hard to imagine what could possess someone to do such things. But by studying his case, we can learn more about the dark side of human nature. Ramirez's story is a reminder that evil does exist in the world, and that we should always be on guard against it. It is also a reminder that even monsters are human beings, and that we should try to understand their motivations before passing judgment. I hope you enjoyed learning about the twisted mind of Richard Ramirez. If you did, please let me know in the comments below. And if you want to learn more about serial killers, stay tuned for more content. Thanks for watching.